Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch, coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. I'm a co-host along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, Chris Tilling, Amy Brown Hughes, and Jules Martinez Olivieri. And we are so grateful that you've tuned in. We're a podcast that seeks to pursue in-depth discussions about biblical studies and theology and the intersection between the two of them. And so we're a collective of biblical scholars and theologians working together toward that common goal. Thanks so much to all of you who support us and listen regularly. We really appreciate that. I always like hearing from those of you who listen. And if you want to, share the word on social media, you can do so. But word of mouth is always best. A personal recommendation, perhaps in a handwritten card, is the way to go. I think it's the way of the future. So, without further ado, we hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome back to OnScript. I'm co-host Drew Johnson, along with all those other people who now co-host with us. And I'm here today with Dr. Christian Eberhart, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of Houston. He graduated from Harvard Divinity School and has a doctorate in Hebrew Bible from the University of Heidelberg, as well as his second doctorate, his Can you say that for me?
Habilitation.
Habilitation. Yeah. So I practiced that actually, so I wouldn't sound silly saying German, but here we are. And that is not in Hebrew Bible. It's in early Christian literature from the University of Mainz. Dr. Eberhart is a seminar founder and convener for the Society for New Testament Studies. He's written and edited many books and articles, including the second edition of one of my most favorite little books that we're going to talk about today, The Sacrifice of Jesus, Understanding Atonement Biblically. Well, welcome, Dr. Christian Eberhart.
Thanks for the introductions, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
So your research has taken a very definitive direction, at least since I've been following you, and that's in ritual studies. And you started in Hebrew Bible, worked in early Christian literature. What attracted you to ritual studies, or how did you go down this path?
Well, I indeed had a number of choices for doctoral work, and they included some very kind of special topics that nobody would ever care about. But and at some point, it was proposed to me to work on something which both scholarship and the church were grappling with. And I was like, well, what would that be? And the answer was, well, atonement, sacrifice. Everybody in the church, a lot of people, and of course more so on specific seasons, call it Good Friday, Easter, talk about the sacrifice of Jesus. There's a lot of talk about atonement or expiation, and a lot of scholarship is actually done on these topics. But there seems to be a certain problem, and if anybody is ever willing to study this problem seriously, to grapple with it, and maybe come to a different conclusion than those conclusions that have been brought before, that would be a major contribution. So that's kind of was the initial thing that got me going on this particular topic.
And since you've written this little book, you'd already had a lot of work out when this time, and I'm calling it a little book because I think it's about 100 pages of writing or so. It's what I would consider a down and dirty, hits the topic hard, and it's very clean. It's very well written. So this is my first introduction into your work, which caused me to go back and look at your more formal work. Much of it was in German, and thankfully some more has come out in English. But since you initially started working on this, there's been a lot written on atonement, especially in Christian theology. In fact, there's been kind of a craze of atonement in Christian philosophical theology. And I wonder, do you feel like, I don't know if you've seen any of that work, or do you feel like it's paying attention to the right things that you've highlighted in your books?
Well, some of it I would say does, but then other books don't really. When I embarked on this scholarly journey, it became clear to me that really the major focus, if you want to successfully explore The area, the major piece of work that has to be done is in fact on the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And if you look at the book Sacrifice of Jesus, it sounds like it's, a big New Testament book, but the majority of it is, for very good reason, is dedicated to a study of sacrificial rituals in Second Temple Judaism. So that means in the Hebrew Bible. That is the solution to the problem. There's a lot of study in New Testament systematics and wherever, where people just very uncritically take the term sacrifice and pretend that it's all clear what that means, and then go ahead and write big important books. But there's one thing about academics, is that we should critically reflect on the terminology that we use, by the way, also on the methodology. So you always have to do that in a critically reflected way. And so in this case, both sacrifice and atonement are the typical terms which you better use and then put a footnote or parenthesis or write a chapter. What do I actually mean with that? What is sacrifice? What is atonement?
And so, and even the name of the book is mildly ironic, because as you note in the book, the term sacrifice in the New Testament, at least, is not applied to Jesus, or it's only applied very selectively. I can imagine, though, when you, as you were working out these details of this argument and you were saying simple facts that you were finding, like the term thusios, that it's actually never used to describe Jesus's death. I remember when the first time I read that, and I thought, well, that can't be right. And I went and started going through databases and saying, like, this can't be true, looking it up. And I was actually somewhat shocked myself. So I wonder, did you get a lot of pushback initially from people on that? People doubting the thesis in general?
Yes, and the pushback is also very indicative of where things go. I found that my scholarship is very well, I would say, respected in the area of biblical studies, and particularly Old Testament Hebrew Bible studies, where people really know the text. So I think I have pretty much little problem. I should never say as a scholar no problems, but a lot of acceptance among people, especially those who study the text. So I'm thinking about people who actually, for instance, write commentaries on the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus, for the audience that doesn't quite know these things, Leviticus is your behated, beloved book when it comes to sacrifice and rituals, because if you're interested in sacrifice and sacrificial rituals, you'll read Leviticus, but most Christians aren't. Okay, so that's why typically when you look at the lectionaries and which texts are used for sermons on Sundays, try to find a sermon preached on Leviticus 1, the burnt offering, you just won't find it. Try to find one on the sin offering, Leviticus 4, you don't find it. See whether you ever find a confirmant whose confirmation, biblical verse is like from the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. That probably won't exist. We just, naturally pick other texts. And so that all describes a little bit the problem. We tend to go elsewhere, and so exploring these blind spots on the maps of where we typically go as church and as academy, that was a big goal for me in my own academic work.
Yeah, so the big claim of this book, which we'll come back to later, is that first century Christians were basically just not referring to the violence of Jesus's death when they thought about the sacrificial item, or thought of it as a sacrifice. But before we get there, I have a larger question, and this is partly just your opinion and partly your research, is why would anybody ever associate violence with sacrifice? Now, I know why people, or I have my own suspicions, but is this the common hurdle that you had to overcome?
Yes, definitely. Why would anybody associate violence with sacrifice? Let's first of all just observe that we do that. Look at the news, and there's a lot of violence, of course. When people die in warfare or die in accidents, then we're very quick to resort to terminology drawn exactly from this area. So here is a soldier, and by the way, it's either just descriptive, so he became a victim of something, but a victim could be a term associated to sacrifice, or especially if you want to give positive meaning out to the whole thing. One is simply stating the facts, but the other is, how do we overcome this tragic event? What kind of language can we employ to help everybody involved not, with the trauma of this event? And that's the moment when everybody will gratefully resort to the term sacrifice. Generals will say it, presidents of countries will say it, they, at the moment the term sacrifice comes, that seems to do the trick. This soldier didn't die in vain. It was a sacrifice, and then, there's all the glory attached to it. So already, just stating that we do this is important. And of course, what it means, sacrifice always is, death occurs, it's tragic, and now we're able to put a positive twist on it. That's what sacrifice is. So that's the interpretive lens, or the terminological filling that most, if not all people today take when they look at either biblical text or simply hear, again, Easter, Good Friday, hear about the sacrifice of Jesus. Okay, so there's death and violence and tragic, and somehow we want to kind of spin this around and make it positive. So if you take that, and a lot of people have done it, even in scholarship, and then you look at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, then you look at sacrificial rituals. You say this is sacrifice, and then you're kind of hardwired to simply bring those images in. It's all about blood. It's all about death, and we're making something which is actually quite bad positive. That then leads to something. The people then who are engaged there, and that's, by the way, let's call it the clergy of Israel, ancient Israel, or Second Temple Judaism, that makes the clergy basically murderers. Okay, there are scholars, I could rattle down the list of names, but in the 70s and 80s, 1970s, 1980s, for whom sacrifice is murder, is killing, is ritualized killing, and that makes Jewish priests complicit in, or actually that makes them first-degree murderers, right? If only of animals, but then of course sometimes there's even sacrifices of humans. So with that, things seem to be clear, except for that when you look at the text, and that's what I did, and had to kind of empty my mind a little bit of these preconceived theories. Suddenly you realize things aren't thus, and in particularly there are indeed types of sacrifice where these theories do not apply at all. And where do they not apply at all? Well, for instance, you could sacrifice grain at the temple. Okay, that was a big eye-opener for me. So wait a second, if sacrifice equals killing and violence, but you're actually baking a pizza and bringing that to God and saying, God, here's a piece for you, and the rest is actually for me and for the priest. I mean, that's basically dinner at my family once or twice a week. Killing? Nope. Violence? Nope. So what is it then? That question remained open. And in fact, there was, I shouldn't say no, but there was basically extremely little scholarship dedicated to this kind of hole within the theoretical framework. Okay, tons of people writing about the one thing, but then you look at this grain offering, and for those who want to study that, that's in Leviticus chapter 2. And of course, this grain offering, or called cereal offering, it also pops up elsewhere, but Leviticus 2 is your description. There has to be something different. That occurred to me. The more I studied it, there has to be a different reading, a different understanding of sacrifice, because otherwise there's one type of sacrifice that completely does not fit at all our theoretical framework, and then the error must be on the side of scholars.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning the language of sacrifice is used equivalently with animals and grain, right? So it's not like there's a different vocabulary around grain.
They're both. There's one umbrella term. So sacrifice, yes, is also a bit complicated because, when today in the modern Western world, we just say sacrifice and maybe victim, and then how they relate, maybe we'll solve it later. But sacrifice is sacrifice is sacrifice. Hebrew Bible is different. There are 2, 3, maybe 4 umbrella terms, and then there's a particular term for every type of sacrifice. And I already mentioned earlier, for instance, there's the burnt offering, sin offering, and now this grain offering or cereal offering, Hebrew mincha, and this mincha, the grain offering, again, it's just grain, and you bring it, and a piece for God, and most of it then for the priest. So how do we conceptualize this type of sacrifice? The umbrella terms, just quickly, the most important would be korban, and korban actually just means to bring close, and that's always to the sanctuary or to God. So a korban is kind of the major umbrella term. All these different types of sacrifice, burnt offering, cereal offering, communion sacrifice, sin offering, guilt offering, they are all equally considered korban, ladonai. So, and I would translate korban as offering or gift.
Yeah. Or it's from karev, the nearness bringing thing. Yeah.
As I said, the Hebrew root really means a movement to the temple, to the sanctuary, or to God. And let's maybe just mention I'm in Jerusalem here right now, and so that will be just to the place over there where the Dome of the Rock is. So that's about a mile from where I'm currently sitting here. So
yeah, I'm interested. Were you raised on a farm or in the city or somewhere in between?
I was raised in a village. I should say 2 villages outside of the next major city would be Hanover, with the soccer team that isn't very successful right now, only second league. So that's where I grew up in a village next to a mid-sized city, Hanover, in northern Germany.
So did you ever hunt? I don't know if they hunt in Germany, but did you ever experience slaughtering animals or dealing with animals, doing what we now consider part of sacrificial activity? Or were you? I was raised a city boy, but when I was in the military, as a teenager, I finally, for the first time, participated in some animal slaughtering when I was on an island in the Caribbean, and that's where my eyes were a little bit open to the fact that, you are killing an animal, for lack of a better English term, but it's
right.
But nobody seemed to have violent intents. It didn't feel violent, and especially because you were eating the animal later. So like violence, it was the first time that I felt like violence wasn't a part of what was happening.
To give you a clear and simple response, no, I mean, there weren't farms, at least in the second village, and I didn't participate in that. But then there was an interesting moment in my life, and already as a scholar, which was, by the way, a book panel exactly about the book that we are currently discussing. So there was a book panel, and it was all very scholarly with other scholars from my institution and other institutions who read the book and all asked their nicely framed scholarly questions. But at the end of the presentation, the thing was pretty much done. And for me, it was already done deal. Okay, now let's go get some coffee. But there was, in fact, a sheep farmer from a sheep farm in Canada who, as I found out later, was himself a Mennonite pastor. And he then suddenly started to ask me 2-3 critical questions. And that was actually when I'd ever attended the slaughtering of sheep, since I'm writing about that in my book. And basically, did I ever have any first-hand knowledge? And I then said, no, actually not really. And long story short is that he then pretty much challenged me, to come out to his sheep farm when it was the time for the slaughter of sheep. And that was, by the way, a Muslim festival that was Eid al-Adha, and which is pretty much an equivalent of the Passover in the Hebrew Bible. So Islam still celebrates that, again, Eid al-Adha. So, and I had to debate it with my family because, of course, gore and blood involved, and we ended up that we decided the kids stay at home. My wife and I went and then saw how animals were being slaughtered, and I prepared ritually for the celebration, and again, that's all according to certain Muslim traditions. And so that was very interesting, and by the way, the farmer and we became good friends over this, and it was an impressive experience. But again, I concur with you. There wasn't violence involved. It's actually the opposite. And you learn, if you live in these kind of cultures, you learn how to do this, how to do the slaughtering, and the goal is always to make this as little violent indeed, and basically as quick as possible. It seems to be a necessary thing that you have to slaughter an animal, but all attempts are put in place to make this as little violent as you possibly can for the animal. So it's not about violence, it's, if anything, to prevent violence.
When I was writing my book on ritual, I was in Jerusalem as well, and me and a buddy went up to Mount Gerizim and watched the Pesach sacrifice of the Samaritans.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah, and that was another interesting moment where he was Brazilian. He said, "This is barbecue. This is literally what we do when we have a barbecue." And it was another one of those paradigm shifts in my head. So.
And yes, I've also looked at the Passover of the Samaritans, and then barbecue is another important term. So while we're discussing, maybe we get to that. But let me just say that I once had a teaching assistant who, when I teach sacrificial rituals in classroom, he had the nice idea to bring actually a little barbecue device into the classroom, and literally while I was saying. And now comes the big solution that I'm offering. Actually, sacrifice isn't about killing. That's one end of the sacrificial ritual. But you actually just need to keep reading until the end of it, because at the end, there's something very different. At the end, there's burning the sacrificial rituals. And finally, I can say, even the pizza offering, even the grain offering, the mincha, that is being burned. You don't kill it, but you burn it in the altar of fire. And all of that, by the way, then is, if we want to compare to anything in our modern culture, that would be your barbecue. And again, interesting, because lots of scholars would say, well, there's an incredible stench of burnt meat. Gee, I mean, if you smell that your neighbor is doing a barbecue, you have to fight not running there, right? I mean, we all know that this instinct, this response to the smell of barbecue. The place was basically, there was a barbecue place. The temple was a barbecue place.
And anybody who barbecues knows that the fatty portions of the meat smell the best as they rise as well. So
that is another thing, exactly. So that's another thing where our modern culture has a hard time reading or understanding Hebrew Bible, sacrifice appropriately. God gets the fat of most of these sacrifices. In the burnt offering, everything is for God except for the hide. But of most of the other animal sacrifices, only the fat goes. And then it's often presented as if that was cheating. Oh, God just gets the crap, basically. I mean, who's interested in the fat in the first place? I once had an interesting challenge because I had to write an encyclopedia article on the term fat. I was like, what do I write about this? And at the same time, I was like, well, they know exactly why they came to me, because I've actually written about this in my research, and if anything, validated that. But still, I felt that was kind of a waste of time. And I'm done in 15 minutes writing 2 sentences. The thing became, however, quite long, because suddenly you realize that fat is a term that typically designs or designates, conveys the best. This is kind of the best, the filet today, we would say the filet piece. And then think bacon. Bacon is probably 50% fat. If you're in a French culture, think magret de canard. Magret de canard is a big piece of duck, but usually with a finger piece of fat underneath. And when you see that for the first time, I was like, well, I'm not going to eat that. And then you actually eat it, and the fat is the most delicious part. These are some aspects that you need to kind of understand. These are some hurdles you have to overcome in order to better conceptualize what's going on in those sacrificial rituals.
Yeah, and even if you're thinking about agrarian subsistence folks who are desperately seeking calories, handing over the fattiest portion, it is a sacrifice.
That is really where fat is actually for populations that are close to starving, not overweight, but close to starving. That's where you want to focus on, and you can prepare animals so that the fat is eaten properly. And by the way, talk about that, First Nations or Native American cultures, they ate the entire buffalo in the plains. Tribes, they didn't just go for the meat of the animal. They ate and utilized everything, but of course also the fat. And there's probably a lot of fat on a buffalo. You
can skip this question if you like, but I often wonder how much damage René Girard did in this discussion, going back to the violence issue. And I don't maybe know if Girard is the only one, but Girard seems to be the one that everybody points to favorably. Right. And I feel like he really misses the boat on the violence issue, or I should say he really injects violence into the system.
He does, yes. René Girard and another scholar, Walter Burgert, they both offer different theories of sacrifice, but they both, the climax in both theories, the climax of sacrifice is both that they focus on killing. Walter Burkert published one of his major works in this area under the Latin title Homo Necans. Homo Necans is in English the killing human. So it's a study of sacrifice. And again, what does it mean about human culture? And he studies Greek, actually not Semitic or Hebrew or biblical, but primarily Greek sacrificial rituals. And his conclusion is that because humans sacrifice, they are killing humans. And again, that's where we were at the beginning. Sacrifice then equals killing. René Girard has a very similar conclusion. Again, sacrifice is in the first place killing, but he will, if you look at the text, pretty much not study rituals of sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible at all. He studies, if anything, a different kind of cultural phenomena. And those are all things that I would call scapegoat rituals or elimination rituals or so, which exist, by the way, in all human cultures. And by the way, there I would fully agree with Girard. I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with Girard. I think that he's perfectly right on when he describes the evil corporate intentions in humanity, where they always single out the weak and the marginalized groups, and then kind of use them as scapegoats. And I would even say that probably applies to world politics. People who just randomly wage war today. Use René Girard for that, and you get the explanation for those evil inclinations of humanity. However, the question is, what kind of language do we apply to describe these inclinations? And now that's where I disagree with Girard, because suddenly he comes in and says, well, that's all sacrifice because it's all killing. So that's, again, this initial reflex, and he uncritically deploys this term, and really has left a massive stain on, or has had a massive influence on, again, scholarship around the term sacrifice, because everybody, whether it's popular employment or whether it's scholars like Burkert or Girard or many others, they all say, well, so yeah, here we go. We know exactly what sacrifice is. But again, Burkert studies sacrificial rituals elsewhere, and Girard doesn't study sacrificial rituals at all. They all fill basically their terminological canisters with stuff from elsewhere, and then apply it uncritically to sacrificial rituals. And that is not what we should do. We should study, as conscious scholars, these texts unto themselves, and that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. Every time I teach Leviticus, I get about 1 week a semester with freshmen, and I have to teach Leviticus. Every time we go through chapters 1 through 6, the question is, well, what's the point of these rituals? What's the purpose? What do they do, right? And so you and I probably have lots of different ideas floating in our heads about what we think they do. But maybe we should start with, what have people said about what these different sacrifices do? What do they accomplish? How do they work? What are the main categories?
Okay, so you mean that I talk about what people say, and therefore probably, and of course Christians typically don't quite know what to say about it, or what those rituals really are about. Because I mean, the first answer is, and I find it always interesting when you go to a scholarly library and you look at the shelves where the commentary series are. And I have to explain maybe to some folks, that a commentary series is where one scholar A writes one book about one book of the Bible, explaining it, sometimes chapter by chapter, sometimes verse by verse, sometimes word by word. So these books can be really thick. And those commentary series are being commissioned regularly. And then scholars take on this immense task. Now, it's always interesting to see, by the way, which volumes are being written first and which ones are last, because, of course, it takes sometimes years, if not decades, if not sometimes half a century, for these commentary series to be complete. And the answer is simple. If it's a Christian commentary series, the first volumes will be written on Genesis and Isaiah and Matthew and, the four Gospels, and Pauline writings, particularly Romans. Well, Galatians first because it's shorter. Romans always takes a bit longer. And the Psalms, okay, so far so good. And at the other end of the spectrum, which commentaries will be the last, and where's always a hole. If you want answers on those things, you don't find them, at least not in commentary series. Well, here you go, Leviticus. and of course other books. But I mean, Leviticus would be first and foremost among those neglected books. If you go to Jewish studies and or what Jewish scholars are fascinated about, you'll actually see the opposite. That Leviticus then is actually a point of interest, and one of the thickest commentary contributions was therefore penned by the eminent scholar and rabbi Jacob Milgram, who wrote 3 massive commentary volumes in the series Anchor Bible about Leviticus. And by the way, who also came late in his life to Jerusalem. There the thing is different. Leviticus is suddenly the focus of attention. And by the way, what I said, you can also do this, run the same thing if you look at children's Bibles. Children's Bibles are just the same thing, like commentary series. If you take a Christian children's Bible with nice illustrations, who really want to give you the run through the Old Testament story, say on 10 or 15 pages. Of course, there's the creation, there's the flood, there's Abraham and all the other guys, and of course the Exodus from Egypt. And then you're really lucky if you find any reference to, the fact that there was a sanctuary built. And then actually the book of Exodus, which really starts with the Exodus from Egypt, but that the mass of it is actually about the building of the tabernacle tent, of the sanctuary of Israel. And that's then only the prelude to the book of Leviticus with its sacrificial rituals. Then again, back to the children's Bible, long story, they get out of Egypt, Israel is saved, and all these things. And then quickly, okay, well, here's maybe a little picture of the sanctuary, the tabernacle tent. Okay, we gloss over those sacrificial rituals, and then we're already they're getting into the promised land. But that's typically how children's Bible shorten down, truncate this history. So you see the focus of interest, and again how the perceptions are very different between the Christian culture and the Jewish culture.
Yeah. So when I ask my 18-year-old students, the ones that are Christian or have read the Bible before, so what is the point of all of this ritual in Leviticus? Number one answer they give me, and if you push them, they don't really have much behind it, but they'll just say, well, it's hygiene, because these are the disease-bearing animals, and these are the clean ones, and God's trying to separate everything. Like, okay, well, that's actually not true. Cows can carry just as many diseases as pigs, but they don't really have any. They don't have any way of dividing up the division of labor of ritual. Like, they're like, I don't know. They just had to do these things to show that they were devoted to God. I'm like, well, okay, that's true, but what did they think they were doing? And so, because I think this is really important for the claim you make later in the book about what does the early church think Jesus's sacrifice adds up to? What does it do in atonement? So what do people suppose in all of those commentaries about what these rituals do for Israel?
Right. So that's where now we enter into the realm of the interpretive side of things. So you can study those sacrifices with regards to just how the elements of their rituals, there's this to be done and that to be done, and they're very detailed descriptions. But then, besides just straightforward do this, do that, do that, there's also an interpretive side. And yes, indeed, these sacrificial rituals will say something about the intention of sacrifices. And there's about 3-4 terms that will regularly come. One is that things will make the offerer, the human being, pleasing to God. The Hebrew term for that is ratzon. So that will bring about delight. We could also say with God. And then another critical term is that sacrifices may atone. Hebrew kippah. The term atone can also sometimes be, depending on the Bible you're using, can be translated to expiate or to propitiate. I think more recent Bible translations have a tendency to rather employ the term atone. Older ones more to expiate. And again, that's typically been the focus of much of the scholarship. Sacrifices then are about atonement. So far, so good. But again, if you keep reading at the other end, there's now usually a very lengthy portion about preparing the burning of the material, animal or grain, and then actually doing that. And then you get some more interpretive terminology, and that is that all of this happens for the now pleasing or soothing smell for God. So there's an explicit reference to God in the whole thing. So the idea is, again, and that's about the smell. It talks literally about the reach, and that it's soothing, reach michoach ladonai. So again, we said this earlier, but why is it pleasing or soothing? Well, because barbecue just smells good. It's not a theory, and that's just sticking your nose out when you're doing hamburgers on the grill in the backyard. So that's what that's all about. And then there's a final interpretive term. Let me just throw that in here, and then we've covered it all. All those materials that are burned on the altar, regardless of the type of sacrifice, they all become ishe. And there's a scholarly dispute how we translate ishe. I would say that that's a fire offering, because they all just become ishe the moment they are burned. So that means they basically dematerialize. And then you wonder, where do they go? Well, that's ishe. It literally shrinks in the fire in front of my eyes, and it basically goes into another realm of existence, and that's the realm of existence where God is and where the spirits are. So that's the interpretive terminology in sacrifice. And again, that's kind of stuff that is then being applied also to in New Testament texts, and of course to the death of Jesus, but not exclusively.
Yeah, and so under that regime, it sounds very transactional. So you have this problem, and here, because I think some people will say, well, isn't that every sacrificial system then? You have this problem, a sacrifice is invented, so let's say for the sociological models, these people invent a sacrifice that solves the problem, and in this case, the problem is something has offended the God, and now you give an offering to the God, and the God is now pleased, and the God no longer hates you. For a lot of people, that's going to sound very transactional and very angry father version of God, if you know what I'm saying.
Right. Or manipulative.
Yeah, manipulative. Yeah, exactly. Or what we call magic in some way.
It is a transactional logic. And if you come to the Middle East, much of it is transactional. I would say actually that human relations are transactional. Yesterday I crossed the old city, and you walk through the souk. So the souk is the marketplace. Right. And basically people they're very friendly. They're looking at you friendly, but of course they want your attention. What for? Well, for a transaction, right? I mean, you're supposed to buy something, and then there's money exchange, and that's what that's all about. And in fact, much of human economy is about transaction. You exchange goods or services for money, or goods for services, and whatnot. And so, I mean, those are very basic categories of human existence. And that's how human society has been existing. And so in a way, the sacrificial cult at the temple is part of that. We also see, therefore, that's the reason why this terminology is readily and easily applied in other areas of human culture. It's not an exception; it's actually rule, because some of these terms can be used also for monetary area. Basically, it's kind of the foundations of an ancient banking system. So all of that kind of overlaps at the temple. The temple was, in fact, a little bit the treasury, the national treasury of the country or the nation of Israel, and then in Second Temple Judaism.
So do you see that as fundamentally it's an economic, but do you see it as a manipulative system? And in the same vein, would you say Jesus' sacrifice is part of that manipulation as well, or there's something more than transaction going on?
I mean, everything can be misunderstood and can be used for manipulative purposes. But I would say, in the first place, this is simply the cognitive or interpretive framework that has been utilized. And by the way, it wasn't the only source of interpretive framework when it comes to either the death of Jesus, or, and now that's a bit broader, and please note the distinction, or why Jesus is the Savior. So to convey this notion that here's Jesus, but we acknowledge him and worship him as the Savior, or why in particular then the death of Jesus is a savings event. That's a bit the question, how we convey this or articulate it in a way that it makes sense to people. Because if you let's just say that that's kind of a fairly new thought. You cannot say something which is new in language that has never existed, because if you use language that never existed, it's like inventing your own language and trying to use that, in the United States or wherever, in Germany or France. If you speak a different language, nobody will understand you. And so, which means, despite the fact that something is new, you actually want to use traditional interpretive categories to convey what is new. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Jesus, to convey how he can be understood as Savior.
So speaking of the temple, you have a whole chapter called The Geography of Sacrifice. And I think for most people, if they haven't studied ritual or Leviticus or just the Old Testament, they haven't spent enough time in it. If you ask them, where is the geography of sacrifice? They would say, oh, it's where the temple. They have one answer, one idea, and it's basically everything happens at the temple. But you kind of show there's a broader geography of sacrifice. Why is it important to understand more than just the temple, or why sacrifice happens up to the temple?
Up to the temple. Well, I mean, if much of the misconception about sacrifice is that it's basically just a second when you kill somebody, then for me the task to counteract, to prove this false and to propose an alternative, was actually to show what sacrifice really is. And for that, the space of sacrifice became important, because that is in fact the place which you approach. So I said earlier that the one of the umbrella terms, a summary term in Hebrew for sacrifice, is korban, and that's built on the root of karav, and that means to bring. So there's constantly this language that you bring things close to the temple. People, ancient Israelites and Jews, would embark on pilgrimages and would sometimes walk for days. So this approach to the temple was a thing that they physically did, and it lasted days. It's like today going on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, for instance. And it's usually a major experience in the lives of people. So that is really the whole thing. There's something else. Then the temple wasn't some filthy, execution place, almost like a concentration camp. That's what all these connotations of killing and violence would associate. The temple is not a gas chamber setup, but the temple was actually one of basically the epitome of beauty and aesthetic achievements of Judaism. If you wanted to know what the best of Judaism was, you go to the temple, because there's a beautiful building, especially under Herod, when it was enlarged and adorned with gold and stuff. That was actually what Judaism was all about, and that was the pride of Second Temple Judaism, which is also why we call it Second Temple Judaism, after that temple. So, just describing the temple in its beauty and how it was refurbished for 80 years with thousands of workers and lots of, that cost a lot of money, but it was a very, I think, worthwhile investment in the opinion of Second Temple Jews, because, that was their heart, and they did it willingly. And so, to kind of reframe the understanding of sacrifice, that's why that's all important. And then also just to kind of help people understand that really this burning right that I'm focusing on, not exclusively, but I mean, that's still one of the important things that I think we need to understand, that really happens exactly at the geographic center or architectural center of this space that's being created. And by the way, yes, animals have to be killed, but that happens in the outskirts, and there's not much language dedicated to that. But then, the center of attention is really at the center is this burning ritual, this kind of barbecue act. That's why I thought that was important, and and included some images in the book as well.
That's very helpful. It makes one wonder then, when we come to Jesus as a sacrifice. So if you want to think of him as a sin, I think about this all the time. The sin sacrifice, which some people might want to portray him as, nobody ever lays their hand on him. So nobody does the samach, where you lay your hand and you confess your sins. And there's no burning, right? So there seems to be there's not a direct connection, at least in any kind of tangible way, between actual death of Jesus, the way it happened, and the way sacrifices roll out in the temple. So in what ways would you say the New Testament authors are conceiving of Jesus as a sacrifice?
Well, you mentioned already that the first thing is we hear this all the time. The New Testament talks about the sacrifice of Jesus, and then you look at the Gospels, and then now, we have to be careful. Let's look for where the term sacrifice, really that term, sacrifice, is applied to Jesus, and pretty much the result is it's not. But of course, sacrifice is more than just the term sacrifice, which, by the way, in Greek is thusia. Sacrifice is also where we talk about blood. Sacrifice is where we use other language, such as, and we just talked about it, such as atonement. Isn't atonement also a reference to sacrifice, since atonement is an interpretive term out of sacrificial rituals? And of course it is. So my response would be, after we said already, the term sacrifice, thusia Greek, is not being used in the context of the Gospels in the language about Jesus, but what does show up will be the term haima, Greek haima, which is blood. Or if we also look at the Christology or soteriology of Paul will sometimes, not hugely often, but nevertheless, will talk about blood and interpret this differently. And I think that comes in precisely because of the Last Supper or Lord's Supper or Eucharist. Now there are different terms about this little meal that Jesus had before his passing, for the crucifixion. And it's iconic, and everybody knows he had some bread and said words of institution, and then there was a cup of wine, and Jesus again says words of institution, and that's where we have a reference to blood. And I think that's exactly now the connection. That's what New Testament authors and the early Christians, by the way, we have to be careful also, they were Jews, okay? They were Jews who read their Jewish scriptures and then try to make sense of what happened to a Jewish Messiah. When they did that, they used that terminology and understood, and I would actually say Jesus did too, understood the term blood in reference to sacrificial rituals found in the Torah. So that's where I think the whole thing was born. And from there, that's at the earliest stages, and then the whole thing evolves, and then Paul, writing in the mid-50s, for instance, in Romans, will also use terminology like atonement. So Jesus was a place of atonement in Romans chapter 3. By the way, NRSV translates incorrectly. NRSV writes Jesus was a sacrifice of atonement. That is actually incorrect, because the Greek term there is hilasterion, and hilasterion does exist in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible or the Testament, but it never means sacrifice of atonement. And for the simple reason that actually in the Old Testament there isn't even a sacrifice of atonement. That's a category which is simply not existent. So, but then again, hilasterion is a term that is being applied, and it actually refers to the Ark of the Covenant, and to the cover is a kind of a wrong term, because it's really
right.
It's being translated as mercy seat. Well, it's the place of atonement. Luther says it's the mercy seat, and really the ark as such is really just the carrying device of the actual cloth piece, and the actual thing is really this gold slab, and that's the hilasterion. So that's what Paul brings in. Paul says Jesus is like this golden coat device, this gold slab, and that's been the place upon which, according to the Torah, atonement was done. And by the way, atonement was done in order to purge the sins and impurities of Israel from the land. So that is kind of being collapsed, that imagery,
right?
And that's how Paul presents the death of Jesus in Romans, for instance.
Yeah, and interestingly, it's bringing you into the scene and into the Holy of Holies, not out by the altar and by the slaughtering event, right?
You're right at the center of sanctity. Exactly.
I'm tempted. I want to do the speed round, but I'll include this as a speed round question. So speed round questions are, you can give simple, short answers, and you don't have to explain anything. You can just answer. So this one, I'll give you a simple answer. Do you fall in the question of the garden at Eden? Was it a temple or not a temple for you?
In a way, yes, because it's about the proximity of God. Obviously, there's no temple building, but you could understand the temple later as trying to recreate paradise,
Okay.
proximity with God. Yes,
That's a great answer. Because I agree with that. What biblical or theological work has the greatest impact on you as a thinker?
Well, let's maybe for the moment focus on the topic of this podcast. But I would say very formative were a few books or people, and certainly among them would be Jacob Milgram, whom I mentioned already, eminent scholar, rabbi. He was from California, and then he wrote the Leviticus commentary. And then another scholar from the University of Strasbourg, that's Alfred Marx, who has also written on sacrifice and theories of sacrifice, and is currently penning a Leviticus commentary as we're speaking. So I was not the person to invent this kind of. Marx is one of the few, if not the only, who's actually dedicated any kind of scholarly effort to the cereal offering, Leviticus 2. So that kind of. So I wasn't alone there, at least. And we've met already before I published my doctorate, and kind of talked about this. So I think those two, among many others, and I apologize for leaving out other important names, but they were certainly kind of critical to where I'm and what I've written.
Excellent. So you live in Houston, at least part of your life. And so here's a test of how much you know Americana poetry. If I say to you, Jimmy cracked corn, how do you feel about that?
Jimmy cracked corn?
Yeah. Do you know this poem?
No.
Okay. Then you would have no feeling. The correct answer was...
That's only from the Gettysburg Address.
It's the correct answer is I don't care. That's the but that's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
If you hadn't become a biblical scholar, what do you think you would be doing with your life?
Well, you're asking that a former retired banker was seriously considering becoming either a musician or a tennis professional. And so I was debating those questions, and maybe I would have tried Wimbledon at some point, but I decided not to, just because I didn't want to retire in the mid-30s or so.
Yeah, excellent. Well, speaking of that, what is your favorite band, and why is it the Eberhart Trio in the basement?
And gee, how do you find out about that?
I should note that basement is spelled BASSMENT.
Okay, yes, that's where my family band performed in Canada. That's a cool little club. So much for the FBI spying behind me. Okay, so in the interest of full disclosure, my wife studied opera singing and has done a lot of performance. My older son currently studies violin and composition, and our younger son also played an instrument, and I'm on several instruments, but usually, I guess what you're referring to, I've been on the piano, but then some of the pieces we're playing are arranged by myself, some I actually composed by myself, so I do compose on the side. Yeah, so
what kind of music?
Well, not sonatas, not symphonies, but popular songs, sometimes kind of churchy is not the right term, but well, you asked about the preferred music or the preferred band, and then, gee, what would I say? I mean, I could just look at my YouTube tabs here, and that will be Queen, and it will be Mike Oldfield. Don't know whether Americans still remember Mike Oldfield, but if I sit down and if I find a grand piano, then I probably play whatever We Are the Champions or.
Oh, nice.
And that being said, I had a classical piano training, so I can still play some of the old things and enjoy that, but then I just try to do my own thing, and why not?
Sounds like fun. What troubles you most about the Bible? Like within the Bible itself, what gives you trouble?
The Bible is a very frank book. It doesn't glorify humanity or human culture, so you have a lot of troublesome text, and I don't want to say that it's all the fault of the God of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, because that would be somewhat unfair. But the Hebrew Bible does something which the New Testament doesn't do. The Hebrew Bible is actually trying to provide a real constitution, almost a political constitution for Israel and Second Temple Judaism. The New Testament doesn't do that. The New Testament has agreed that there isn't no longer any option for political authority or autonomy, for the simple reason that the Romans own the country. They're all under the hegemony of the Roman Empire. So there's no longer any much of a political option. And if it ever existed, then Jesus and Paul never thought they would be part of that. I mean, they were kind of looking for a spiritual realm. But that's different while much of the literature of the Second Temple is also actually written in the exile. But the vision was still to come back to the country and have a constitution in place, if it wasn't indeed the older kind of traces of that political constitution. Why am I saying that? Because that also means that two things have to be taken seriously. One is, kind of a legal system with things like punishing and then capital punishment. So that's one thing. And the other is really seriously discuss warfare and to what degree you can do it, and simply also descriptively that warfare happened because there was this little tiny people surrounded by other superpowers, and they had to defend themselves. And mostly, by the way, went pretty bad, and sometimes they were successful, but in the ancient Near East, there was, sorry to say that, but happy slaughtering. In fact, for most of the history of humanity, and the Roman Empire included, I mean, they just butchered each other mercilessly. That's something which we have to acknowledge, and that went on right at the core of the power of the Roman Empire, because most emperors did not die a natural death. I mean, if they weren't killed by their entourage, they decided quickly to commit suicide, like Nero. It was not a particularly peaceful time back then, and in that place of the world. So that's now, you said speed answering and and lecturing on here. But I just want to say that we have to keep all of that in mind as we're kind of doing this thing. So
that's good. Okay, this might be impossible, but can you give us a basic greeting, like a hello, in either the Ojibwe language or Lakota Sioux?
In Lakota Sioux, Tunik Tukahuo, how are you doing?
Okay, we won't explain how you knew that. No, how did you? I noticed that you listed these First Nation languages on your LinkedIn, and I'm interested to know why you spent any time learning those languages.
Well, I think it's just very important to know about the history in the United States, because it's not just 100 years like in Texas or 300 years, but it goes on, and everybody should know people like Tatonka Yotake, right? Sitting Bull, Tatonka Yotake. And it's not just about, dances with wolves, but there are other real people, and studying real history puts you in touch with the real world. Hollywood is just way too much just fantasy and propaganda, and I prefer to study the real world.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Oklahoma, so we Native American history was part of Oklahoma history, which I really appreciated. Well, Dr. Christian Eberhart, it's been a joy to meet you finally, and to hear you talk through these issues of ritual, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, Drew, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for your questions, and all the best.
You've been listening to On Script, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.